So it's not a great idea if you're in California to take your soil sample and send it up to New Hampshire and have it tested, because their soils are very different. And so the advice you're going to get from a lab in New Hampshire is not going to be good for the soil you have in California.
You're listening to How I Grow This, exploring stories of gardeners from across the globe as we learn from their biggest tips and tricks to some of the things not to do. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the How I Grow This podcast. I'm your host, Luke Hammond, and I'm really excited to invite special guest Robert Pavlis with Gardening Fundamentals. He's an author of how many books now, Robert? Like 10, 15?
14, I think.
14 different books, and a lot of them are just debunking gardening myths. And so I think you guys are in for a huge treat. Diving into this conversation and kind of being a fly on the wall as I kind of respond to some of these videos, hear his story, and I hope you get a ton of valuable information out of it. I'm sure you will. So without any further ado, let's welcome our guest, Robert. Welcome to the How I Grow This podcast.
It's great to be here.
Well,
thanks for inviting me.
Hey, absolutely. Well, I wanted to dive in first, and people have probably seen your face, seen some videos on YouTube if they're in that world, and have probably seen some of the stuff about you, but they may not know a little bit about your story, what got you started in gardening. If you could just open up and just share a little bit of your story, that would be awesome.
Sure. Well, they can usually find me on video by looking for the hat. I had this cool idea using a hat. Actually, someone else did it too. And I thought, well, I'll get this hat. So I got this red hat and I just wear it all the time. And people are probably wondering, why the hell are you always wearing a hat indoors? But it gets me recognized. So this whole thing started about 15 years ago. My background is in science, so chemistry, biochemistry. I then ran a software company where we developed scientific software for 25 years. And as I was getting near the retirement age or near the point I wanted to retire, I sort of did two things. One is I started writing about gardening. And the second thing is I bought a large property. So I bought a 6-acre property that had virtually nothing on it except some wild trees, and started turning it into a botanical garden. So over the next 10 years, we ended up planting over 3,000 different species of plants, trees, shrubs, perennials. A lot of those I grew from seed because they're unusual things that you can't buy. And along that journey, I also started writing. Now, I've been gardening since I was about 20, so the gardening wasn't necessarily new for me, but doing a botanical garden was new for me. So it was a combination of those things. So I'd experiment and do things and research things and go out and do them in the garden, and then I'd write about them. And my passion has always been to try and understand the truth in things. And even many years ago, I learned that whatever hobby I got interested in, there's just so many myths. Like, people have beliefs that are just not true. And as I got to know a hobby better and better, I start finding this out, both through research and through doing things. And gardening is no different from that. So I started a blog called gardenmyths.com. And actually, what I wanted to do is write a book, but I thought, I don't think I have the energy to write a book. So let me start a blog, and I'll do that for a year, and I'll post these articles. And if I'm still doing it at the end of the year, I'll consider a book. And I didn't know if I could find enough myths even to fill a book. So at the end of the year, I was still doing it. I was enjoying it. And I had more myths at the end of the year than when I started. So I still do. I've been doing this for, 13 years, I think. And I have a list of some like 400 myths I haven't been able to write about yet because there's just too many of them. I write one and I find two new ones and I put it on the list. So most of my writing is really trying to drill down into the I like to say the science, but I try to make it very understandable for the average person. So these aren't scientific books in any way. So I look at the science, I look at research papers, I look at whatever information I can find, and then I distill it down into something that's easy to digest by the average gardener.
Mhm.
And that's what I've been doing for the last 13 years.
So when did you start this blog? Like, was that pretty early in blog world? How long ago was that?
It wasn't that early, but it was about 13 years ago.
Okay.
So WordPress was around, so I started with
Yep.
WordPress, and there were quite a few blogs at the time. I wasn't that early. Now, in my
Gotcha.
career, when
Gotcha.
I started my software company, that was pretty early. My first portable laptop was the size of a suitcase. You could barely lift it.
Right.
That had just come out, and we got one, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is portable. You can actually carry it somewhere. Um,
Yeah.
so
So much computing power.
there was nothing in it. I mean, compared to today, but
Yeah.
so the blogs were around, but blogging has changed dramatically, uh, mostly in
Uh-huh.
the last 2 or 3 years, and I don't know, you probably don't care about that, but AI has completely changed the whole blogging world, and how
Hmm.
people use blogs and so on. And in some ways, it's destroyed blogging. Yeah, that's a whole other issue, but
That's a whole other podcast, right?
that's a several podcasts
the
probably. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm not against
Well,
AI, by the way, but there are issues certainly.
yeah. Now, let's talk about one of the big things we talk about on this show is context. Because everyone's gardening in very different parts of the world. And they're watching people from all over different parts of the world try things and do things in the garden that might not work in their area. And so your garden most of your personal growing experiences is where?
Zone 5, Southern Ontario.
Okay,
Uh,
so Zone 5, Southern Ontario, pretty far north. When does your last frost date
well,
kind of typically hit?
we haven't really had a real frost yet. We've had some light
Hmm.
frost, enough to kill tomato plants. That was about 2 weeks ago. But we have not had a hard frost. But that's very unusual. So
Hmm.
20 years ago, by 1st of September, we were watching for frost. And by middle of September, we probably would have lost our tomato plants, because tomato plants are
Mm,
really sensitive to low temperatures, right?
mhm.
They don't even need a frost. If you get 2 degrees, they're probably done. Sorry, 2 degrees centigrade. So, a little bit above freezing, they're
Yeah,
done.
34, 35 degrees Fahrenheit for the rest of
Yeah. Well, if
us.
actually
Us.
30, 36, 37 kind of thing, right? They can't really take cold temperatures. Now we'll go. Well, this year we went pretty much all the way through the end of October without frost. Okay, but
Hmm.
that's unusual. Usually we
Okay.
get to about
When
the
it
middle of October.
when is your first frost of the spring?
Well,
Or
that's
last frost, not first frost. Last frost. Yeah.
yeah. Um, well, as a rule of thumb, we plant out, June 1st. This is a rule of thumb.
Okay.
Most of our gardeners cheat that, and we'll do May 15th or so, May 20th, watching the weather and so on. But I'm now planting by the 1st of May,
Uh-huh.
even late April some years. So it's backed up several weeks as well. One of the things that I think is critical is that we can't count on these things. We have to remember these are averages, right?
Hmm.
When we look at the zones, those are 30-year averages, and
Uh-huh.
so this year, hey, we had a great year. We started early and ended late, but next year could be the exact opposite. So it
Uh-huh.
doesn't mean that those frost dates are fixed in stone. And I see lots of people online talking about the date that they do things. And I warn you, you got to look at the calendar, right? Look 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, and see what is the forecast. And you
Uh-huh.
got to go with what's happening, not by some date. Um,
Right. I think there's a little bit I like describing it to like an artist or in the music world, a certain guitar player can play a guitar lick and it sounds different if somebody else is playing that same intonation. It's something in the fingerprints of the actual guitar player that created the lick, and it just sounds different. I,
Yeah.
I think there's this artistry of gardeners or farmers that kind of have that sixth sense of what's going to happen, what it feels like. There's all those uh, cut a persimmon open, and if it's a spoon or a knife or a fork, it's going to predict the winter. Is that one of the garden myths that you've
Uh,
looked
uh,
into?
I've never heard that one, but I can pretty much guarantee it's not true. I don't know of any way to predict the weather. People look at certain insects and whatever insects do early in the winter or late in the winter, whatever. None of those things really work. Um, every year is going to be a little different. We're talking about 30-year averages. Some are early, some are late, and we have to adjust. Now, the
Hmm.
great thing about
Okay.
backyard gardeners, though, is that we're not investing a lot of money into this, right? So I'll go and plant early, and I figure, okay, if I lose the peas, so what? Peas are pretty cheap. I'll just replant them a week later. It's not
Hmm.
like a farm or a market grow garden where they plant everything and they lose a bunch of money if they did it wrong, right? Us gardeners,
Right.
we can cheat things. And in fact, I have a slideshow where I actually show my garden in the wintertime and I say, we can gamble, right? So we plant really early and if everything gets covered in snow and frost and when everything, we lose everything, so what? We just do it again a couple weeks later.
I really love that. I love that spirit of kind of, hey, so what? Let's try it.
That's
Let's
right.
try to debunk the norms. Let's try to grow a tomato all the way as late as we can. Let's try to, start something early and see what happens. That's the scientific method.
Yeah.
Um, Give it a try.
So in fact,
I'd
this
like to.
year I had my tomatoes. I took cuttings with the fruit on them and brought them in, put them in a pail of water because I'd read that this will ripen them. And I've got ripe tomatoes in the other room that actually look pretty good. They're almost ready to eat. And yet outside they've been
There you
gone
go.
for 3 weeks, right?
There you go. So did you just put the stem into the water, or did you put?
Yeah, yeah. I cut longer stems, so the stems were like 2 feet long with the tomatoes at the end, and I
Mhm.
just put them in some water, and the water will keep the stem fresher, and the leaves kept them a little fresher for a little while, and they seem to be doing really well. Um,
Hmm. I might
so
try that. I got several thousand still on the vine because we haven't hit our hard first frost, and we've been down in the 34 degrees this morning, but my tomatoes are still vibrant and going to town. So that would be Fahrenheit. Uh,
yeah,
but I'd like to kind of transition. Some of the myths you talk about really reach people that maybe haven't studied soil science, and you talk a lot about the differences of fertilizers and specifically NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Um, One of the videos I watched, you kind of broke down the advice that was given of a particular fertilization of, I think the advice was eighth of a teaspoon in a gallon of water, poured out on your plants. And then you kind of like talked about that. What is NPK and the numbers that are on any sort of fertilizer bag, and what do they mean? And if you can kind of start there, I'd like to dig into that.
sure. So the three numbers NPK. And the way you remember them is that if you write out the names of these compounds are actually alphabetical. So you can remember what order they go in. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're the three most important macronutrients for plants. Now there are other macronutrients. So carbon and oxygen are two, but plants can get lots of that. And then there's magnesium and calcium. And most of the time, plants can get lots of that too. So we're not as worried about those. Sulfur can be a little bit of an issue. But the main three that um, may be in short supply, and plants, we have to make sure plants get them as the NPK, and that's why they're in the fertilizer, right? And out of those three, the N is actually the most important. Nitrogen limits plant growth in almost every case. If we increase nitrogen, you'll get more plant growth. Now, it doesn't mean it's better plant growth, and it doesn't necessarily mean you get better yield, but it usually goes hand in hand. So nitrogen is what's keeping our plants from producing more, as a general rule. Now, you could have soil that has no potassium, and then, of course, potassium is important too. But as an average, most soil has enough phosphorus and potassium, or at least has enough that plants can grow reasonably well. It's the nitrogen that's a problem. Now, there's another reason why nitrogen is a problem, and that is that it's very soluble. So it basically runs away. As soon as it rains, it runs away. And in fact, it's one reason why when you send in a soil test, the standard test doesn't measure for nitrogen, which seems very odd, right? I just said nitrogen is the most important nutrient, but soil tests don't measure for nitrogen. And the reason is that by the time you take your sample down to the lab and they measure it, your soil is different. So the number is meaningless. So that's why they don't do nitrogen. Now, in agriculture, they can do nitrogen, but it's a special task that has to be handled a certain way. So those are the three key nutrients that we care about, and they're the three that are mostly in fertilizer. Now, when gardeners talk about fertilizer, it's kind of interesting that they have conversations with each other. They go online and give advice to each other, but the advice is never complete enough so that the reader can actually use it. So what's very common is someone will say, how much fertilizer do you use? And someone replies, says, I use 1/8 of a teaspoon. That's a meaningless bit of information. Now, they might go a little further and they might say, well, I use 1/8 of a teaspoon and I put that into a gallon. Even that's useless information, because unless I know what your NPK is, the 1/8 teaspoon doesn't tell me anything. So I basically need three pieces of information. I need to know how much you're using that 1/8 teaspoon. I need to know how much you're putting it in. Is this like a 10-liter pail or a 5-gallon pail or a 1 gallon, or what is it? How much you put it making up? And you have to know the NPK of the fertilizer. Unless you know all three things, the information you've just been given is kind of useless. And yet gardeners run off and say, oh, I'm going to try that. Well, they really can't, because they're missing. So there's three pieces of information. So I encourage gardeners to start using parts per million, ppm. That's never going to happen in my lifetime. But if you tell me how many ppm nitrogen you're using, I know exactly how to make it up. I can use any fertilizer. I can make up any size batch. I can use any amount that suits me. And I know I can make 100 ppm. Okay? And now that's a little hard to calculate for most people. So in fact, on my blog, gardenmist.com, I actually made a calculator for you. So you enter the NPK you have and how much you want to make and the units you want to use, basically, and it tells you how to make it up. So, but gardeners really should start doing that. Okay. How much fertilizer do you use is another important question. So, like, for instance, you and I, we're in different locations, quite different. Our soils are going to be different. Let's say we both grow the exact same tomatoes, but our soil is different. The amount of light we get is different. Day length is different. All those variables. You and I can't sit here and agree on the right amount of fertilizer to use. Okay? Now, if we're talking about potted plants or house plants or containers, that's different. That's a different subject. But we're talking about real soil out in the garden. And the reason is that both our soils have different nutrients to start with, right? So you might have to add a whole bunch of potassium because your soil is low in potassium. My soil might be low in nitrogen, so I have to add a whole bunch of nitrogen. So you and I will use completely different fertilizers because our starting soil is different. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another really important concept that most gardeners seem to not understand. That's why I can't get online and tell people how much fertilizer to use in their garden. It's a meaningless number. Even if I use ppm, it's a meaningless number because your soil is completely different than my soil. I
Mm-hmm.
use more organic matter. I use less organic matter. I use a different type of organic matter. All those things are important. And unless we know those, we really can't tell each other how much fertilizer to use. Okay. Um,
Now, let's say that we begin to get a lot of data points. We're looking at a soil report. We're looking at, um, a full analysis of what that looks like. What suggestions then? Because this is what an agronomist will do. They'll look at as many data points and data set points that they can, and then they give, if you will, a prescription. Um, or a protocol that the grower can then follow.
right.
Um, so what kind of data points are you going to look for first when you're talking to a grower in wherever they're from? What are the most important data points that you try to lean in on?
Well, you want to look at those key nutrients. Now, as I said, nitrogen is really hard to test, so that leaves potassium and phosphorus. Those are the two most important ones for most people. I'd say most soil has calcium, magnesium, unless it's very sandy soil. Right? Very sandy soil has
Mhm.
very little of anything, so you'd measure all of those. Sulfur is one we almost never talk about. And one of the reasons is that years ago we had a lot of sulfur pollution, right? We had acid rain, which was made by sulfur in the air that was made by factories. And the fertilizers we produced weren't very pure, and they had sulfur in them too. So we never had to worry about sulfur. There was always lots coming to our soil, but our fertilizers are much purer now. We have a lot less acid rain, so we're finding more and more soils that are sulfur deficient. So you're going to find that sulfur is going to become more important, and you want to measure it too. So those are the macronutrients. In most cases, you can ignore the micronutrients unless you have some reason to think that you have to go after them. So look at the macros, find out what you have, and then whoever's doing the soil test should be able to give you a reasonable suggestion as to how to fix the problem you have. So they'll tell you how much of each of these nutrients you have, and then they should give you, in effect, a recipe on how to fix it. Okay, how much,
Mhm.
if you're short of potassium, how much potassium should you be adding? Okay, if you're
Mhm.
short of phosphorus, how much should you be adding? Um, if the soil lab isn't doing that, then you really should find a different soil lab. Okay?
Yeah.
Um, and unless I have some, special knowledge about certain crops or certain types of soils, I'm better off listening to that lab. Now, one of the things that's important there is that the lab has to know what kind of soil you have. So it's not a great idea if you're in California to take your soil sample and send it up to New Hampshire and have it tested, because their soils are very different. And so the advice you're going to get from a lab in New Hampshire, an agricultural type lab, is not going to be good for the soil you have in California, right? So ideally you want to get the testing done locally, and that lab will have information about your local soil and will be able to make an educated guess as to what to use. And then I would follow that. In fact, one of the things I discussed, not so much a myth, but it sort of is, we tell a lot of gardeners is go get your soil test done. And in the US, you guys are really lucky because your soil test is really cheap compared to the rest of the world. Even in Canada, it's much more expensive. But in the US, everyone goes and gets their soil test done. But the first question you should ask yourself is, what are you going to do with the results? Are you going to follow the advice you're given? And many gardeners don't want to do that because it can be complicated, right? You need a certain amount of potassium and a certain amount of phosphorus. You might have to buy 2 or 3 fertilizers and mix them together and so on. And you get this report and you kind of throw your hands up and say, oh, it's too complicated. I'm going to go out and buy some 10, 10, 10 and throw it around. Well, if you're going to do that, don't bother getting the soil test, right? The soil test is only going to be valuable if you actually follow the advice.
Hmm. A lot of people online, they stray away entirely from any sort of obviously synthetic or petroleum based
Mhm.
fertilizer. Um, and everyone is not everyone, but many people are pushing into the organic movement. And the only thing that is suggested is compost.
Right.
But I think you and I would both agree that all compost is not created equal.
Yeah.
Um, and what should a person be looking for in the compost that they may be applying to their garden?
Well, that's tricky. You can get compost tested. Not a lot of people do that, and it really isn't worth your while. There's two downsides to compost that people have to be aware of. So compost has some real benefits over synthetic fertilizer, and we can talk about those if you're interested. Compost, and I'm going to use a general term compost for anything that's really organic. So this can be composted manure, it can be manure, it can be mushroom compost, all kinds of things. Basically, organic matter that's digested to some extent. The one thing that's really important to understand is that most of the nutrients in compost are not available to your plants the day you apply it. Okay. So let's say I have a handful of compost and a handful of synthetic fertilizer, and I go out in the morning and I spread them on my two different garden beds. The one that gets synthetic gets fertilized right away. The plants can use it almost immediately as soon as I water that in. On the compost side, though, there's very few nutrients that's available for the plants. Okay, so I haven't really helped the plants today. The advantage of the compost is that it's going to take another 5 years, and that's a rough number, to slowly decompose. And as it decomposes, it releases a small amount of nutrients every day, year in, year out. And it takes, most of it comes out in the first 3 years, and then the rest comes out in the next 2 years. But it's a slow process. And people have to understand that. So with compost, I'm not feeding my plants today. I'm working on the long-term development of my garden. Right? Um, and for that reason, what's in the compost isn't quite as important. It's all there. So they have all the nutrients, they have all the micronutrients, which is one of the benefits of compost. It's a complete set of nutrients for the plants. And they will be slowly released over time, which is actually better for the plants and it's better for the soil. But it's a slow process. You have to understand that. So if you're a new gardener and you're starting your garden, this spring, and you throw, I'm going to throw in a whole bunch of compost and my plants will just take off. Well, they may not, because that compost needs time to decompose. It needs time to release those nutrients. Now, 3 years from now, if I do that every year, my garden's going to be really great because I have the first year's compost releasing nutrients. I have the second year's releasing nutrients. I have the third year releasing nutrients, and so on. Now I've got lots of nutrients becoming available. But that first year, they may not grow that well because I'm not really giving them enough nutrients. So in most cases, I think the advantage of compost is that we know we have everything and we don't really have to worry about what's in it. If we look at where the compost comes from, it's all plant material, right? Even if you go and get some manure, what is manure? It's just plant material that's gone through a digestive system called a cow, but it's still plant material. If I get vermicompost, it's still plant material at some point, and the worm has processed it and it comes out. So it all starts as plants, and plants have all these nutrients. Otherwise, they can't grow. Okay? If they're missing any of these nutrients, the plant can't grow. So whenever we have plant material, we automatically know that at least it has some of every one of the nutrients that plants need to grow. And that's really one of the big benefits of compost.
So I think I want to ask a little bit more questions and maybe push back here on that. If there may be a imbalance of specific kinds of nutrients within that compost that's being made based on the types of ingredients and of the source of the compost, because compost is really just an active decomposition process of any organic matter breaking down. Um, many compost producers, at least in the United States, typically have gone to two different waste streams. A waste stream via, a conventional animal processing plant, either that be the butcher waste,
Mhm.
and that way that compost is going to carry a bunch of blood and bones and hide and things that are not used in the butchering process, or a manure waste, and that's going to be incorporated into that compost. Then they're going to some sort of carbon waste stream, because if it rots, it's essentially high in nitrogen. And then if it is a woody species, it's going to be high in carbon. And so they'll go to maybe a sawmill or a tree service and get all this carbon. And then they're beginning to mix the compost together. And sometimes it just stops with a 2-ingredient compost because they've got this abundant source of chicken manure and carbon, or dairy manure and carbon, or butcher waste and carbon. And there's not a big diversity of inputs. So within some composts, there's only so many nutrients in disproportionate evaluations, if you will. So I don't know if it's going to have everything that you might want within that compost if you're applying it to your garden. So you can kind of respond to
So,
that.
yeah. So I guess it depends on how you want to word this. So when I said it has everything, it does. You can simply not grow a plant without all those nutrients. Okay. There's
Mhm.
around 20 of the nutrients they need. If one of those is non-existent, you can't grow the plant.
Right.
Okay. So the fact that we got a plant to grow means they were all there. Now, you could argue that, one type of plant and another type of plant have different ratios of some of those nutrients. So one may have a little more iron, the other has a little less
In
iron.
terms of need.
Okay. No, in terms of what's inside the plant, which in effect is the need as well. So I'm thinking we're gonna harvest this plant material and we're gonna use it in composting. The amounts of these nutrients are going to vary depending on the source that you get this from.
Mhm.
But we know they're all there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have plants. And the same argument holds for animals. So if you're using animal parts, now, bones are going to have a different distribution of nutrients than blood, for instance.
Mhm.
But if you look at the animal or manure from an animal, sort of an aggregate, it's going to have it all. You cannot create animal cells with all the 20 nutrients that animals need. And they're essentially the same nutrients that plants need. Okay, so when we talk about these 20 nutrients that plants need, they're the nutrients we need as well. And we can't live without it. So if we can't get any iron, we won't exist. We need some iron. Plants are the
Mhm.
same way. They need some iron. Now, some parts of an animal will have more iron and some less, and some plants will have a little more and some less, and so on. And we could get very technical about this and start doing a whole bunch of lab analysis. But at
Mhm.
the end of the day, for the average gardener, they all have all those nutrients. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist.
So that leads me into kind of a question of nutrient flow. Okay. Nutrient flow. And so what I'm referencing here in regards to nutrient flow is the way that a plant is interacting with a soil profile and a soil structure, to where that plant is emitting root exudates through photosynthesis and sending complex sugars and amino acids down through their root system, telling the army of microbes what to mine from the chemistry that's in the soil profile. And then it's beginning to draw that up through water, through transpiration, and bring those nutrients up into the plant. Um, Certain things through that growth process can get halted or um, disrupted by either an excess of a certain nutrient in extreme portions or a lack of, that would be a minimum. We've talked about these kind of minimum thresholds of NPK and minimum thresholds, of some of these micronutrients that may not exist. And there's a scientific law that was created, Liebig's law of the minimum, where your yield is only as good as your minimum of each of the values of each individual chemical compound. So that would be your nutrients. So if we're talking about nutrient flow and we have active microbes and we have a plant growing and something seems to not be correct, there seems to be, excessive pest issues, a disease, or yellowing, how would somebody go about correcting these problems through their observation?
Okay, well, there's a lot of information there. So let's first go back to this idea that the plants creating these exudates and getting the microbes to mine the right minerals. Okay, that's sort of true, but in many ways it's not true, because the microbes are going to do whatever they're going to do and need to do for their life existence. What the plant is able to do is surround itself with lots of microbes, thousands of different species, who in aggregate produce the nutrients that the plant needs. And the plant is able, with some nutrients, to bring in the ones they need, and with other nutrients they can't. They just flow in. They don't control those. So the plant, I don't think the plant has quite as much control over that process as maybe that sounded. What the plant is doing, though, is it's using the microbes to break down soil and organic matter. So it's not just the soil, but anything that's in the soil. These microbes are going out and continuing that digestive process and making the concentration of these nutrients high around the roots. And then it's up to the plant to take in what it needs. And for at least half the nutrients, it's able to control that. So if it says, okay, I've got lots of iron, I don't need more, it stops bringing it in. If it's short, it brings in more. So the plant does control how it absorbs some of these things. Now, the other question is quite different. So if I look at a plant, how do I tell what it needs, what's missing? And we're going to talk about gardeners here. I'm not talking about farmers who have been farming the same crops for years and have a lot of experience and knowledge, but the average gardener. There are lots of memes out there that show you different leaves and different colors of leaves, and you get this kind of spotting, or you get green veins or white veins and so on. It's this deficiency. Those memes are not true. Okay, you cannot tell a nutrient deficiency by looking at a leaf. Okay, a certain nutrient deficiency will cause a certain symptom in the leaf, but you can't look at the leaf and determine the deficiency. And that's a very common notion in the gardening world, that, yeah, you go out in your garden, you look at your leaf and it looks this way. Oh, it's kind of red. That means you need more phosphorus. Okay, that doesn't work. The only way a gardener can know if they have a deficiency is to get the soil tested. Now, granted, farmers and people who've grown the same crops for years and know their soil, they get to kind of guess better than the average gardener. But even though that's based on their historical knowledge, not by looking at the plant. You can't take a leaf, take it inside, look it up on the internet and match it up to one and say, okay, this looks like this one that has the same symptoms, so I know what the problem is. Okay. The only way to know
I think
deficiency is to get it tested.
I think a lot of that is based on common diagnostics. So, you can look at it and you can probably see that this could be a likely cause based on the observational data or the anecdotal evidence of a yellowing leaf on the edges here, or, purple veining of a tomato here at this season. And I know X, Y, and Z from the past. I know I have this soil medium. I know I'm growing this tomato start here. I know it got down to this temperature at this point. Therefore, it's probably having a phosphorus deficiency because it got down to this temperature, and it may not be in the soil, but it's a nutrient uptake issue. So I think there's a data set there. I also think that without testing the tissue or the sap, you're not going to really know the evidence. But the question becomes, what fixes the problem? And so it leads me into this question, because there's a lot of stuff out there regarding tomatoes, obviously, and peppers, regarding blossom end rot. Let's talk about blossom end rot, BER. The most challenging thing out there, and for a lot of growers, depending on where they're at. Let's talk about it.
All right. So for a number of years, scientists told us that BER is a result of a lack of calcium in the fruit, and that's still true. But more recently, we've learned why there's a lack of calcium in the fruit. So a lot of people have heard this now, and they say, okay, I need calcium. I don't have enough calcium in my plant. I'll throw some calcium in the soil. But it turns out that the reason the plant doesn't have calcium in the fruit is actually a watering issue. So what the plant does is if it can't get enough water, it has trouble pulling in enough calcium, and it actually directs it to growth. It directs it to the new buds at the top, not to the fruit. So this calcium is kind of, it's not unique, but it's special in this way that the plant can control where it sends the calcium. So the plant says, okay, I have trouble getting enough calcium in my roots because of a watering issue. So I'm going to send this to where I need it most, which is in my growing tip. And I'm going to abandon the fruit. And so the fruit doesn't get enough calcium. So the calcium level is low in the fruit, but it has nothing to do with calcium in the soil. We can add as much calcium as you want to the soil. It's not going to fix the problem because it's not a calcium deficiency issue. The other thing that's kind of special about calcium is that a plant can't move it around very much. So some nutrients, like nitrogen, a plant can take from one spot in the plant, like the lower older leaves, and move it to the new spot if it needs it. Can't do that with calcium. So once it's in a spot in a plant, it can't move it. This is one of the reasons why calcium sprays don't work for BER, because you spray the plant, calcium gets absorbed by the leaves, but the leaves can't send it to the fruit. It gets stuck in the leaves. So we now know BER is essentially a watering issue. We need to keep the water level constant around the roots, and then the plant is less likely to have BER. Now, if you had soil that was deficient in calcium, it can still be a calcium deficiency, right? Because if you have sandy soil and you have no calcium in your soil, then the plant can't get any, and it's not a watering issue. But again, most soil has enough calcium. So what this means is that all the remedies that people come up with, like putting egg shells in the soil and putting banana peels in the soil and all these other things where they're trying to add calcium, or people who add magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, for some reason, they think it has calcium in it in the soil. None of these are going to work because the calcium isn't going to get into the fruit. You're not solving the problem.
So I want to push back on that a little bit. I agree with most of the things you said there. The one thing that I disagree with would be the calcium. It's a calcium uptake issue. Just like you described, the calcium is not able to get to the fruit. And that could be for multiple different reasons. If you have poor watering, that is a possibility. And the way you describe the way nutrient flows of calcium into the plant, into the fruit, if it's not getting enough available calcium, it's going to go to the leaf structure and so it doesn't rob it. So if you provide a bioavailable soluble calcium that's available to your leaf tip, it would fix the blossom end problem, because then it can pull the calcium from the soil profile and not be needing to feed it to the leaf tip. And so that would fix the problem.
I guess in that respect, it would help. The question is whether the roots actually know that the leaf tip has extra calcium.
So I'm going to say this, this is from my growing experience. I'm a professional market gardener farmer in Arizona. My soil, I've tested my soil. We've got plenty of calcium. We're right there in the 70 to 75 base saturation of calcium. It's all there, but every year I'm challenged. I've got spot on watering techniques, great water, checking everything with probes at multiple levels. Like I'm there I know the water is good. But what begins to happen as the temperature changes and things begin to change and fruit sets come on, I also have a very, very, I've got high phosphorus, which can tie up calcium.
Mm-hmm.
I've also got a very extremely high pH, which I don't worry about too much, but I am an alkaline soil, which can tie up other nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
My soil pH here is about an 8.3, and so that can tie up nutrients. And so when you're working with super alkaline soils, and you have alkaline water, you've got to figure out a way to get these things bioavailable. And so this is why I'm pushing back strong, because I've had, fruit sets all have blossom and rot. And then I have to, drop that fruit, do a mid-season pivot because it is my livelihood, make sure they have an available calcium in the next, without changing the watering at all, with boom, the next fruit set is perfect. And so that's where I'm pushing back a little bit, just asking questions, because I don't know that it's always a watering issue. I think it's a calcium uptake issue. And there's so many different soils, as we described. And I've talked and consulted with many, many commercial growers across, North America and here down in Mexico. Same thing in the pepper industry, where there's specific timing at fruit set to make sure that calcium is able to flow into that plant. For the home gardener, I think there's tons of myths. This eggshell thing, there's just not enough available calcium in an eggshell. I did the math once, and I think it would have taken me for like 1 acre. I think I needed 116,000 eggs. I think it was almost 11,000 dozen eggs. And at the time, I think the price of eggs were like averaging $8 a dozen or something for conventional eggs. I was like, that's probably not a sustainable solution for me, at least for this 1 acre. So anyway, go ahead.
I'll come back. Actually, the other myth is Tums, right? Tums have a lot of calcium in it. So people say put a Tum in. So I actually calculated how many Tums you need to get the calcium level up to the recommended amount. And you need to, it was something like 70 or 80 Tums in each planting hole per tomato to add enough calcium.
For each hole. So
each hole. Yeah. So, it just, again, that's assuming it's a calcium issue, right?
Right.
To get enough calcium into the soil that you need using Tums, you'd have to put like 80 Tums in each hole, which is going to cost you a fortune, right?
And I don't even know this, but that's pre-assumption of the solubility of the calcium within that Tum.
Yeah, I made a bunch of assumptions. I took
right. So same thing with me in my
calcium amount, right? So
within the eggshell analogy, you have to have a high amount of time and or acids to break down the calcium into a plant available form.
Yeah, in your soil, it's not going to work anyways, because you have to have a pH of around 5 or less to make the calcium soluble from an eggshell. Right. So with your whatever 8.3 there, you're never going to get any calcium out of it.
Right.
Now, the one thing you said was kind of interesting is that you have some of this issue early in the year, and then you do some things, and then you have good fruit set, and you don't have BER anymore. One of the other things that is quite common is that the fruits have more BER problem early in the season. So the first fruit sets they have a higher probability of showing BER than later fruit sets. So there probably is a at least for us, there's probably a temperature factor in there as well, right? Or it has to do with the fact that the plant reaches a certain maturity and then it changes the way it's moving calcium around. But it's quite common around here to see BER on the first fruit set and then not after that, even though you've done nothing different, right? So
Uh-huh.
it's
Uh-huh.
either a temperature or maturity, plant maturity thing. Maybe the root system isn't big enough yet for the first root system or something.
That would
And
be
the
my
other thing
first
that's important too
inclination.
is the cultivars, right? So some cultivars are much more prone to BER than others.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This would be, for the most part, across the board. I grow about 8 different tomato cultivars. I mean, obviously, like you're not going to have a calcium deficiency for the most part on like cherry tomatoes. I've never seen it.
Right.
Um, I you see it on large slicing tomatoes. You'll see it on early girls, celebrities, beefsteak varieties. Very rare you're going to get it on a tiny tomato. You'll see decreased fruit set
Mm-hmm.
um, significantly. You won't have the big long runs of beautiful tomatoes pushing it that way. Um, there's a couple things you hit on it here, and I want to dive in there a little bit. Um, what are some of these myths that people it's all over the internet, made famous by TikTok probably? You named one of them with the eggshells, you named two of them with the banana. What are a few others that people should just, pump the brakes and go, maybe I shouldn't try this banana water thing? Um, what are a few more where they just need to pump the brakes and say, let's get a little bit of evidence here?
Quite honestly, most of the DIY solutions, whether it's for nutrients or pests or anything else, basically 95% or more don't work. So anytime you see a DIY where you're going into the kitchen or the hardware store and you're buying some stuff that's not designed for gardening and you're taking out in the garden to use it, it's probably not going to work. And there's a
Hmm.
long, long list of those. The only the only one that I've come across that really works well is milk is actually fairly good for stopping fungal diseases like powdery mildew and so on. And it's actually been tested and works. And so is baking soda
Does that
also works.
does that work really well as a pasteurized version of that milk, or does it need to be um,
Never
an
seen.
unpasteurized?
I've never seen anyone mention pasteurization. So they're not sure why it works, but um, milk with a higher fat content works better than a lower fat content. So they figured it has something to do with the fat and probably changes in pH on the surface of the leaves. But I don't think they know why it works yet. So people recommend like a 2% milk works better than skim milk.
Hmm. Would
Um,
whole work better than 2%?
Probably.
Which,
Uh, and the other
yes.
thing to understand with that, you see, this is the other thing with meth. So I say that works, but it doesn't cure the problem. Okay, this is a preventative spray. So you have to spray it before you have powdery mildew. Once you see the start of it, it will stop the spread of it. So powdery mildew will make more spores and they'll infect your leaf and it will kind of halt that. So it prevents the leaves getting worse, but it won't get rid of the infection that's there. Right. So,
Mm.
and you have to spray it regularly. Every time it rains sort of thing, got to spray it again. So, but
You know, there,
almost other DIY solutions either don't work or there's no support for them.
Gotcha. I wanted to jump back into that powdery mildew because I think a lot of growers, do have challenges with that. Depending on the season, you said spray it when it rains. There's a lot out there where powdery mildew actually gets decreased when it rains because
Mhm.
the spores are pushed off the leaf from the rain structure, and powdery mildew actually grows better in hot and dry than wet. Um, so what does that look like?
So the reason I said you have to spray after rain is because the rain washes the milk off, right? So you have to reapply it.
Oh, okay.
So powdery mildew is actually an interesting organism. So we talk about powdery mildew, but in fact it's many hundreds of different diseases, and pretty much every plant type has a different powdery mildew, even though when we look at it, they all look the same. And we call them all the same. So the one issue we have is that we say, oh, a plant has powdery mildew and such happens, but that's a different organism than the plant next to it. So the one thing to understand is that if my lilac has powdery mildew, it's not going to spread to the plant next to it. Okay. Um, the other thing that is interesting about powdery mildew is for it to spread, you need sort of two things to happen. So this is a fungal organism. It makes spores. It releases the spores into the air. They float around and land all over the place. Those spores are like little seeds that have to germinate, and they actually have a little root type thing that enters the leaf. It actually burrows into the leaf and grows inside the leaf. So two things have to happen. You have to make spores and you have to infect the plant. You have to germinate. And one of the things I've always heard about is, well, you cut down on powdery mildew if you have less humidity around the plant. So people talk about thinning plants, have more airflow and so on. Well, it turns out, and I'm probably going to get these backwards, but it turns out that I think it's high humidity prevents sporulation, the creation of the spores, and low humidity prevents germination, or the other way around. Okay, so when we're talking about humidity around these plants, it kind of needs both. At one point in its life, it needs low humidity. Another point, it needs high humidity. And so saying that if we just change the humidity, we're going to eliminate powdery mildew is not necessarily true. So in fact, I'm pretty sure the germination happens when the plant is very wet. So if we spray the plant and the spores are sitting there ready to germinate, they get wet, and that moisture allows them to germinate and infect the plant. Right. But moisture also prevents sporulation, which means we don't create the spores in the first place. So controlling powdery mildew is actually kind of tricky. And for a home gardener, the best solution really is to look for cultivars that don't get powdery mildew. Because controlling humidity out in a garden is really complicated, right? If you're in a greenhouse and so on, you have some controls, but out in a garden setting, there's not much a gardener can do. You can plant things a little farther apart, maybe, to give a little more airflow, but you get whatever humidity nature's going to give you.
Right. Yeah, I guess in the West, you could control it a little bit by overhead irrigation because you're already dry.
Yeah.
And you can control it and bump that sphere of humidity up because it's just going to lift.
But that doesn't last.
But the other way around, you can't make it drier.
And that doesn't last very long unless you're
right.
You're irrigating your sprayings are misting for a long period of time, right? If you just water, that's another thing. Another method is people talk about when should you water? Should you water in the evening or at noon or in the morning? And people say, well, you don't want to do it in the evening because the plants stay wet and so on. I did a little experiment where I actually went out and sprayed some plants, and I measured how long it took for the moisture to evaporate. And basically, within 30 minutes, the moisture was gone. Whether it was in the sun or it was in the shade or it was inside a plant where it was really congested or outside, it didn't really make a lot of difference. So when we water, the moisture is there for a short period of time and then it's gone. Now, that, of course, depends on humidity, right? If you're in a very humid place, then it's humid anyways, whether you water or not, right? If you're in a very dry location, it's going to evaporate faster. Southern Ontario tends in the summertime is kind of a humid place. So that number was for my location, right? Not for a dry desert with nice winds blowing through it.
Yeah. One of the things, because I still have a farm in Missouri, which is pretty humid. And, I'm farming currently in Arizona, and I've farmed a lot in Arizona. And the practices couldn't be more different. I mean, just you couldn't. The principles are the same, but the practices and the functionality are very different. For example, for me to produce off-season lettuce, I'm cooling my plants with irrigation. The middle of the day, it's 105 degrees.
Yeah.
But I'm cooling the lettuce with irrigation, and that helps me be able to produce good lettuce. Not as good as like fall and spring, of course, but it helps me to be able to produce lettuce and bring it to market at 105, 108 degrees, depending on the physiological growth stage of that plant. Then, if I was to do that in the Midwest, I'm going to have all kinds of fungal issues and challenges if they're wet going into the evening, inside a tunnel or a space like that. So, couldn't be more different. In terms of the actual practice of when timing of that irrigation. In Arizona, everyone is very water conscious, as we should be. And so you have to recognize that it will use more water and you won't penetrate as deep because it's evaporating off the surface of that soil so quickly. So if you want to conserve water, you want to water, very early in the morning or in the late evening. So I think there's that at play as well for when the suggestions are out there of when to water. Um,
So do you
so anyway,
water continuously, or do you like a 15-minute watering and then wait an hour, do another 15-minute, or?
yeah, no, it depends on the crops and it depends on the time. So if it's lettuce and it's growing in a tunnel, maybe under shade or something like that, I may just run the irrigation long enough to cool it off, and I'm creating evaporative cooling. And so that may just be a 5-minute blast on a timer set at 1 p.m. and then 3 p.m. And that's constantly changing and monitoring based on how hot our temps are.
Right.
Um, and then it shifts off in the same way that to germinate carrots, to have fall carrots, we're trying to plant them in early August. It's 108 and 10% humidity, and I can't let that crust dry out. I got to water at least 5 times a day to make sure that crust doesn't dry out to get germination on a carrot for at least 2 weeks. And so it all depends on the crop, the timing, the growth stage of that crop, and how established that root structure is. So, and even depending on parts of the field, I've got parts of the field that may drain a little bit quicker too. And so it's a whole thing. If it was easy, everyone would do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that's important to understand. You're getting to know your system really well, and so you're fine tuning these things for your specific location.
Okay.
A lot of gardeners are reading about this somewhere and running off and thinking it's just going to work, and they're not putting effort into understanding the details of what you're doing. And so a lot of times these suggestions don't work.
Right. I think that is a great sum up of the How I Grow This podcast. We're trying to dig into how different people grow, what they grow, where they grow, and just really evaluating that and kind of raising the question of know your soil, know your context, and know your goals. And in doing that, we're going to break down a lot of these gardening myths that are generalized blanket statements across the globe. And Robert, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for spending the time having these conversations. It was a lot of fun. I know that there's all these different contexts and different things that we see, and I could probably talk to you all day and maybe argue back and forth about a couple different things or push back on nuances. But I just want to say thank you for doing what you're doing, for putting this out there and putting yourself out there on the internet for scrutiny. Anybody who puts themselves out there could be scrutinized one way or another. And I'm sure you've read the comments and get all the fun joys of conversation through doing what you're doing.
And it lets me learn something new usually. So it's been fun. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's great.
Awesome. Well, for those who don't know, where can people find you out there on the internet? Your blogs, your books, you're on YouTube a lot. Where
So
can people find you?
the two main channels I have is gardenmyths.com is my main blog. It has over 700 articles, and we talk at least 2,000 different myths on there. And then on video, I have a channel called Garden Fundamentals. And so you can find me mostly on Garden Fundamentals on YouTube, Spotify, and we have a Facebook group that everyone's welcome to join, and you can ask questions there. So Garden Myths and Garden Fundamentals.
That's awesome. Again, Robert Pavlis, go to gardenmyths.com or Gardening Fundamentals on YouTube, and make sure you hit the like and subscribe. Give him the support and the love. This podcast was brought to you by Seed Time. If you are needing a software that is able to help align you and keep you on task and journal through the gardening and growing season, Seed Time is your go-to resource for that. Make sure you check out and see all the things that you have to offer, and you can get started today absolutely free. And that is a free version for life. So if you need help planning out and plotting your garden calendar for your geographic location, check out seedtime.us. Thanks, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode of the How I Grow This podcast. I'm your host, Luke Hammond. Man, thanks for staying tuned all the way to the end. We're so excited that you're here, and that probably means that you enjoyed what you heard and you found some value in it. If you could, go and share this with somebody that you know that really helps push it forward in the algorithm. Hit a like, a subscribe, hit a review. It makes all the difference for us. Thank you for listening to the How I Grow This podcast, and we are dedicated to bringing more of these stories to you to help you grow at the next level. We'll see you.